the early months of 1932, as Japanese forces consolidated their occupation of Shanghai, military commanders faced a troubling reality that would lead to one of the 20th century's most systematic violations of human rights. Following widespread reports of sexual violence committed by soldiers against Chinese civilians, the Imperial Japanese Army began implementing what they would call the Comfort Women System, a bureaucratized network of military sexual slavery that would ultimately ensnare an estimated 80,000 to 200,000 women and girls across Asia and the Pacific. The women who would be swept into the system came from ordinary lives. In rural Korean villages, teenage girls helped their families tend rice paddies and dreamed of futures that seemed within reach. In the Philippines, young women attended school and worked in their communities. In China, Indonesia, Taiwan, and beyond, countless others lived lives shaped by family, tradition, and hope. They could not have imagined the fate that military planners in Tokyo and regional command centers were already designing for them. The origins of the comfort station system reflected a calculated military logic that treated women's bodies as strategic resources. Japanese military authorities observed that soldiers committed mass rapes during campaigns in China, creating international condemnation and damaging morale. They worried about venereal diseases spreading through the ranks. They feared that soldiers might reveal military secrets to local women. The solution they devised was not to address the underlying culture of violence and misogyny, but to institutionalize it under military control. Beginning in Shanghai in 1932 and expanding dramatically after the full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the Japanese military established comfort stations wherever their forces advanced. These facilities operated under direct military supervision, with detailed regulations governing their establishment and operation. Military documents would later reveal the systematic nature of this enterprise: requisition forms for women, transportation schedules, medical examination protocols, and operational guidelines. The military treated the procurement of women with the same bureaucratic efficiency it applied to the procurement of weapons and supplies. The methods of recruitment revealed the predatory nature of the system. In Korea, which Japan had colonized in 1910, recruiters employed deception on a massive scale. They approached families in villages, promising young women jobs in factories, restaurants, or nursing positions. They spoke of good wages and opportunities to support struggling families during economically desperate times. Parents who consented did so believing they were providing their daughters with legitimate employment. Kim Hak-sun, who in 1991 would become one of the first survivors to speak publicly, was 17 when a man approached her foster father with promises of work. She thought she was going to a factory. Instead, she found herself transported to China and confined in a military comfort station. Her story mirrored those of thousands of others who discovered too late that the promises were lies designed to secure their compliance until escape became impossible. Others were taken through more direct coercion or outright force. In occupied territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, military personnel simply seized women and girls from their communities. Jan Ruffo Hearn, a Dutch teenager living in the Dutch East Indies, was taken from a civilian internment camp along with other young women and transported to a comfort station in Java. Maria Rosa Henson from the Philippines was dragged from her village by Japanese soldiers when she was 14 years old. For women in occupied territories, there was no pretense of choice, only the raw exercise of military power over civilian populations. The comfort stations themselves varied in form but shared a common function. Some occupied requisition buildings in cities, others were temporary structures near battlefronts, and some existed in remote jungle outposts. The military classified them by rank, certain facilities for officers, others for enlisted men. Regulations specified operating hours, pricing structures, and the number of men each woman would be required to accommodate. The daily reality for the women trapped in these stations was one of relentless brutality and dehumanization. Survivors who later testified spoke of days that began before dawn and lasted late into the night. The numbers varied by location and circumstances. Some women described being forced to accommodate 10 to 15 soldiers daily. Others spoke of 30, 40, or more on weekends or before troops deployed to combat. On the eve of major military operations, the numbers could surge even higher as commanders allowed soldiers what they euphemistically called recreation. The women lived in conditions of constant fear and physical suffering. They endured repeated sexual violence that left them with injuries, infections, and trauma that would mark the rest of their lives. Many contracted sexually transmitted diseases despite the military's required medical examinations. Some became pregnant and were forced to undergo abortions or give birth in the stations. The physical toll was compounded by psychological torment, the shame forced upon them, the isolation from everything familiar, and the complete loss of autonomy over their own bodies and lives. Control was maintained through multiple mechanisms. The stations operated under strict military discipline, with guards ensuring women could not escape. Some women reported being beaten if they resisted or showed signs of illness that might reduce their availability. They were confined to small rooms, sometimes shared, with minimal personal belongings. Their identification papers were typically confiscated, making escape nearly impossible even if they could get past the guards. In remote locations surrounded by hostile territory or jungle, geography itself became a prison. The psychological dimensions of this captivity ran deep. Many women internalized profound shame, even though they were victims of a criminal system. This shame was weaponized by their captors and would be reinforced by their societies after liberation. They lived in isolation from one another, prevented from forming the bonds of solidarity that might have sustained resistance. Some attempted suicide, seeing no other escape from their circumstances. Others developed survival strategies, emotional numbness, dissociation from their bodies, finding small moments of humanity with one another when possible. The geographic scope of the system reflected the extent of Japanese military expansion. Comfort stations operated in China, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and across numerous Pacific islands. Anywhere the Imperial Japanese military established a presence, the infrastructure of sexual slavery followed. The women came from all these territories as well, though the majority were Korean, with significant numbers of Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, and Taiwanese women, along with smaller numbers of Dutch, Australian, and other nationalities. As the war progressed and Japan's military fortunes declined, conditions in the comfort stations deteriorated further. Women in forward areas faced the dangers of combat as Allied forces advanced. Some were killed in bombing raids or artillery strikes. Others were abandoned by retreating Japanese forces and left to fend for themselves in war zones far from home. In some cases, as defeat loomed, Japanese soldiers killed comfort women to prevent them from testifying about what they had endured. The end of the war in August 1945 brought liberation but not freedom in any meaningful sense for most of the survivors. Many found themselves stranded in foreign lands with no means to return home. They had no money, no documentation, and often no knowledge of local languages. Some remained in the countries where they had been held, unable to face the journey home or the shame they feared would greet them there. Others made desperate efforts to return, traveling for months through the chaos of the immediate post-war period. For those who did make it home, the suffering continued in different forms. In Korea and other societies with strong Confucian traditions emphasizing female chastity, women who had been sexually violated, even through enslavement, faced social stigma and rejection. Many could not marry or were abandoned by fiancés when their pasts became known. Families sometimes refused to accept them back. The shame that had been weaponized against them in the comfort stations now became a social barrier to reintegration. The survivors made devastating choices to protect themselves and maintain some semblance of normal life. Most chose silence, burying their experiences deep within themselves and telling no one. Not their families, not their children, sometimes not even their husbands. They invented false histories to explain the missing years. They carried their trauma alone, without the possibility of counseling or support that might have eased their burden. The psychological toll was immense. Studies conducted decades later would document extraordinarily high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicidal ideation among survivors. Meanwhile, the historical record was being actively suppressed and denied. As the war ended, Japanese military units systematically destroyed documents relating to the comfort women system. The Japanese government maintained that the comfort stations had been private commercial enterprises with no military involvement. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East prosecuted Japanese war crimes in Tokyo, the comfort women system received minimal attention. A few cases were tried in regional tribunals, but the systematic nature of the crime went largely unexamined. No high-ranking officials were held accountable specifically for creating and maintaining the system of sexual slavery. In the decades following the war, the silence deepened. Japan's rapid economic development and its transformation into an American ally during the Cold War created little appetite for confronting difficult wartime history. In Korea, authoritarian governments focused on economic development and security concerns, not on demanding justice for women whose suffering seemed to belong to a painful past better forgotten. The survivors themselves, scattered and isolated, lacked any platform to speak or any indication that anyone wished to hear their stories. This enforced silence began to crack in the 1980s as broader social movements created new possibilities. The global women's rights movement provided frameworks for understanding sexual violence as a war crime and human rights violation rather than merely unfortunate collateral damage. In South Korea, democratization movements challenged authoritarian governments and opened space for confronting historical injustices. Feminist activists and historians in Korea, Japan, and beyond began researching the comfort women system, piecing together evidence that the Japanese government had denied for decades. The breakthrough came in 1991 when Kim Hak-sun stepped forward publicly in Seoul. At 67 years old, she held a press conference and spoke the words she had kept silent for nearly 5 decades. She had been a comfort woman for the Japanese military. Her testimony opened a floodgate. Within months, other survivors in Korea began coming forward, then women in the Philippines, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, and elsewhere. Each testimony added detail to the historical record that governments had tried to erase. The survivors who came forward demonstrated extraordinary courage. They were mostly elderly, in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, speaking about experiences from their youth that they had hidden their entire adult lives. They faced the stigma they had feared for decades, with some family members and community members rejecting them. They endured skepticism and outright denial from Japanese officials and nationalist commentators who questioned their truthfulness or claimed they had been willing prostitutes. Yet they persisted, driven by a determination that the truth be known and acknowledged before they died. The testimonies followed similar patterns across nationalities and locations, a consistency that reinforced their credibility. Women described the deception or force used to procure them, the military control of the stations, the systematic sexual violence, the health consequences, and the lasting trauma. They provided specific details about locations, military units, and organizational structures. Their accounts aligned with documents that researchers were beginning to uncover in military archives in Japan and other countries. In 1992, historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered official Japanese military documents in the National Institute for Defense Studies Library in Tokyo proving direct military involvement in establishing and operating comfort stations. These documents demolished the Japanese government's long-standing claim that comfort stations had been purely private enterprises. Faced with documentary evidence, the Japanese government was forced to acknowledge some degree of military involvement. This acknowledgement, however, fell far short of what survivors demanded. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued a statement admitting that comfort stations had operated under military authority and that recruitment had involved coercion and force. The statement expressed apologies and remorse, yet it stopped short of accepting full legal responsibility, and subsequent Japanese governments have offered mixed messages, with some officials questioning or attempting to revise the Kono statement's conclusions. The survivors organized and pursued justice through multiple channels. In 1992, former comfort women from Korea filed a lawsuit in Tokyo District Court, demanding official apologies and compensation. Similar lawsuits followed from survivors in other countries. Almost all failed in Japanese courts, which cited statutes of limitations or the principle that individuals could not sue states for wartime actions. The legal defeats were bitter disappointments, but the trials provided platforms for survivors to testify publicly and created detailed legal records of the system. In 1995, the Japanese government established the Asian Women's Fund, a semi-private foundation offering monetary payments to former comfort women. Many survivors rejected this as inadequate because the payments came from private donations rather than direct government compensation, which they saw as the government avoiding legal responsibility. The controversy over the Asian Women's Fund revealed the depth of disagreement over what justice required. Survivors wanted not just money, but acknowledgement of legal responsibility, official apologies, and historical accountability. Activist groups, led by survivors themselves, worked to ensure the comfort women issue remained visible. The Korean Council for Women, drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan, founded in 1990, organized weekly demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul every Wednesday since 1992, demonstrations that continue to this day, making them one of the longest-running protests in history. Survivors attended despite advancing age and declining health, demanding that the Japanese government provide a sincere apology and legal compensation before they died. The international community gradually took notice. In 1996, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights appointed Radhika Kumaraswamy as Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women to investigate the comfort women issue. Her report concluded that the comfort women system constituted sexual slavery and a crime against humanity under international law. She recommended that Japan accept legal responsibility, pay compensation to individual survivors, and ensure this history was taught in Japanese schools. Japan rejected most of these recommendations. In 2000, activists organized the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery in Tokyo. This was a people's tribunal without official legal standing, but it brought together survivors, international lawyers, judges, and human rights experts. Over 4 days, survivors gave testimony, and prosecutors presented evidence of systematic sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. The tribunal issued a judgment finding Emperor Hirohito and other Japanese officials guilty of crimes against humanity. While legally symbolic, the tribunal gave survivors their day in court when national courts had failed them. The political dimensions of the comfort women issue have been contentious between Japan and its neighbors, particularly South Korea. Periodic agreements between governments have raised hopes only to collapse amid survivor opposition or political backlash. In 2015, Japan and South Korea reached an agreement that Japan called final and irreversible, providing funding for a foundation supporting survivors in exchange for South Korea agreeing not to criticize Japan internationally over the issue. Many survivors rejected this agreement, arguing they had not been consulted and that it prioritized diplomatic relations over justice. The foundation was ultimately dissolved. Meanwhile, the surviving women grew older and fewer in number. In the early 1990s, when survivors first came forward, hundreds were still alive. By the 2000s, that number had dwindled to dozens in most countries. By the 2020s, only a handful remained. Each death represented not just a personal loss but the closing of a living connection to this history. Activists recognized that soon all direct testimony would be lost, making the documentary record and historical memory even more critical. The survivors used their remaining time to educate and advocate. Women like Lee Yong-soo in South Korea, Jan Ruffo-Hearn in Australia, and Gil Won-ok in South Korea traveled internationally, speaking at universities, conferences, and to government bodies. They met with young people, passing on their stories to a generation born long after the war. They participated in documentary films, oral history projects, and educational initiatives designed to preserve their testimonies for the future. Memorialization efforts created permanent markers of this history. In 2011, activists erected the first Statue of Peace in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, a bronze sculpture of a young girl sitting in a chair, representing the comfort women victims. The statue became a powerful symbol, with replicas placed in cities worldwide. Each statue served as a reminder and a call for justice. The Japanese government objected to these memorials, viewing them as obstacles to improved bilateral relations, while activists saw them as essential to keeping the history visible. The testimonies of survivors revealed not just the historical facts but the lifelong impact of what they endured. Many described decades of nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive memories. They spoke of relationships they could not form, children they chose not to have, and opportunities foreclosed by trauma and stigma. Some described finding peace in activism, transforming their suffering into advocacy so that no other women would endure what they had. Others remained deeply wounded until their final days, never finding the acknowledgement or healing they deserved. The historical and political debates continue even as the last survivors pass away. In Japan, textbook controversies erupt periodically over how to teach or whether to include the comfort women system in school curricula. Conservative politicians and commentators sometimes deny or minimize what occurred, sparking protests from survivors and activists. Progressive Japanese historians, activists, and citizens work to ensure accurate history is preserved and taught. In 2021, academic controversies erupted over a paper by a Japanese scholar arguing the comfort women were contractual workers, not slaves. A claim thoroughly refuted by the overwhelming historical evidence but indicative of ongoing denialism. The legacy of the comfort women system extends beyond the specific historical case to broader questions about wartime sexual violence, accountability, and justice. The courage of the survivors in coming forward helped establish sexual violence in war as a crime that the international community takes seriously. The establishment of the International Criminal Court and its inclusion of rape and sexual slavery as crimes against humanity and war crimes reflects this evolution in international law. The comfort women survivors contributed to these developments through their advocacy and testimony. Contemporary conflicts continue to feature sexual violence as a weapon of war and a consequence of military occupation. From Bosnia to Rwanda to Syria, women and girls have been systematically raped and enslaved. The comfort women survivors and activists have drawn explicit connections between these contemporary atrocities and the historical system, arguing that failure to achieve justice for past crimes enables future ones. They have advocated for robust international mechanisms to prevent sexual violence in conflict and ensure accountability when it occurs. The struggle for historical memory remains contested terrain. What societies choose to remember and how they remember it reveals much about their values and priorities. The comfort women survivors fought for decades to have their experiences acknowledged as part of official history rather than erased or distorted. They insisted that their suffering be recognized not as the inevitable collateral damage of war, but as a systematic crime that could have been prevented and that must be condemned. They demanded that perpetrators and the state that deployed them be held accountable, not allowed to hide behind the passage of time or diplomatic convenience. The survivors also resisted being reduced to victims. While they testified to their suffering, they also demonstrated resilience, agency, and moral courage. They survived not just the comfort stations but the decades of silence and stigma that followed. When they finally spoke, they did so on their own terms, demanding justice rather than pity. They organized, protested, sued, traveled, and educated. They refused to let their stories be forgotten or distorted. In their final years, even as their bodies weakened, many maintained remarkable strength of purpose. The question of what survivors wanted was always clear, even as governments debated and delayed. They wanted official acknowledgement from the Japanese government that the comfort women system constituted sexual slavery and a crime against humanity. They wanted sincere apologies directed to them personally, not vague statements of remorse. They wanted legal compensation from the Japanese government as recognition of legal responsibility. They wanted punishment for perpetrators, or at least their identification and historical condemnation. They wanted accurate history taught in Japanese schools so future generations would know what occurred. They wanted guarantees that such atrocities would never be repeated. These demands remained largely unfulfilled. While the Japanese government made limited acknowledgments and offered payments through indirect mechanisms, it never accepted full legal responsibility or provided the unequivocal apology survivors sought. No perpetrators were punished specifically for crimes related to the comfort women system. Japanese school curricula treatment of the topic has been inconsistent and politically contentious. For the survivors, this failure to achieve full justice was a source of profound pain. Yet the survivors achieved something significant nonetheless. They broke decades of silence and ensured their history became part of the public record. They educated millions of people worldwide about the comfort women system. They contributed to the evolution of international human rights law regarding wartime sexual violence. They inspired younger generations of activists working for women's rights and historical justice. They demonstrated that even the most marginalized and stigmatized victims can speak truth to power and demand accountability. As the last survivors reach the ends of their lives, the responsibility for preserving this history passes to subsequent generations. Historians, educators, activists, and citizens worldwide must ensure that the comfort women system is remembered accurately and that the lessons it teaches are not forgotten. The documentary evidence, the military records, the survivor testimonies, the scholarly research provides a foundation. Memorials and educational programs create touchpoints for public memory. International law and institutions offer frameworks for preventing similar crimes. The comfort women system represents one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. A systematic, bureaucratized infrastructure of sexual slavery that ensnared tens of thousands of women and girls across Asia and the Pacific. It was a crime of immense scale facilitated by military power, patriarchal social structures, and colonial exploitation. Its impacts rippled across decades, affecting not just the women who were enslaved but their families, communities, and societies. The failure to achieve full justice for survivors represents an ongoing moral failure. Yet the story of the comfort women is not only one of victimization but also of resistance, resilience, and the persistent human demand for truth and justice. The survivors who spoke out did so against enormous personal cost, motivated by a commitment that their suffering have meaning and that the truth be known. They transformed their pain into advocacy and their trauma into testimony. They refused to be forgotten or silenced. In doing so, they honored not only themselves but also the women who did not survive, who died in the comfort stations or in the decades after without ever having the chance to speak their truths. As we remember the comfort women, we honor their humanity, the lives they might have lived, the dreams that were stolen from them, the suffering they endured, and the courage they demonstrated. We acknowledge the failure of justice systems and governments to provide them the accountability they deserved. We commit to ensuring their history is preserved and taught honestly. We recognize the ongoing struggle against sexual violence in conflict worldwide and the connections between historical injustices and contemporary ones. And we listen to the voices of the survivors who spoke, ensuring that their testimonies continue to educate, to challenge, and to demand that humanity do better.